Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New Hampshire Archaeological Society 2021 Archaeology Month presentations. Today, we are pleased to welcome Heather Rockwell, professor at Salve, Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. And she's going to present on use-wear analysis. Heather began her career in archaeology in 2003 as a scrap field school student. She has a BA from Beloit College, an MA from the University of Tulsa, and a PhD from the University of Wyoming, with an emphasis on Paleolithic and Paleo-Indian archaeology. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, I am going to share my screen and I'll take it away. Thank you all for being here today. I love working with NHAS. They're a really wonderful organization. So if any of you aren't members, you should definitely join. They do lots of great stuff. Today, I am going to be talking to you about what I call wicked awesome rocks. I have loved rocks for years, since my early childhood, in fact. And more specifically, I love stone tools. Even from my really early years, one of my most treasured possessions was a projectile point necklace that my grandfather gave me when I was just 7 years old. It's a projectile point that he set in silver that he found down in Connecticut. And it's one of the things I still have today and really love. And I think it started my early fascination with stone tool technology. Now, as Dick said, I started doing archaeology in New Hampshire nearly 20 years ago when I was just 15. And that's when my love for these tools really kind of developed into an almost obsession. I tried to dig up a picture of me with my first projectile point. I know it exists, but I cannot find it. But I remember it was a small, sort of unassuming, triangular-shaped woodland point, not unlike the one that I'm showing here. I found it doing a shovel test pit with Doug Dickinson, who was a long-standing scrapper. And during a survey of the Connecticut lakes in northern New Hampshire, this kind of thrill of discovery moment continued, but I really wanted more out of it. I want to know, how are these made? Why do they look the way they do? And most importantly, how are they used? And this took me into the field of what's called microwear and use-wear analysis. To put this really simply, this is the study of damage occurring to stone tools as a result of their use. And this obeys sort of the rules of how we make stone tools. Stone tools can't be made on anything. If you pick up a granite cobble and you try to make it into a projectile point, it's probably not going to go great. So it obeys these certain laws. So this last question of how they got used became the focus of my academic career in archaeology. During my master's work at the University of Tulsa, I got introduced to this concept of use-wear analysis. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of history of this discipline, because it kind of shapes the way we use this technique today. And then I'm going to explain how it's done and give a brief example from my own research of how this can help us better understand the past. So starting with a little bit of history, this actually began in Russia. This is a man named Sergei Semyonov. He was a Russian archaeologist working in the 50s. And he had a lab in Moscow that shared space with a metal shop, which is a very Cold War Russia story. Well, I will say this is sort of classic for archaeologists in general. Many of us sort of have lab spaces in weird locations. My own lab is actually in a converted stable block. The lab at the University of Wyoming was actually in an old cheese lab. So I feel like they always kind of stick the archaeologists in these weird corners of the world. But Mr. Semyonov became inspired when he was looking at the metal drill bits that were being used in this metal shop and noticed that on these drill bits, there were tiny lines that looked similar to the way they were used. So for instance, on a drill bit, he noticed that the tiny lines on the drills would occur in spirals. And he asked himself, is this something we could apply to the examination of stone tools? And he noticed in particular that as these metal tools were used more and more, these lines, what he called striations, became more visible. So not only do they conform to sort of how the tool is being used, but the intensity of that use. So for instance, he noticed that the fine lines on a drill bit differed from those on like a planing tool. So if you have metal tools at home today, you can go kind of examine them and see that the way lines accrue on these is a little bit different. And out of this work came his publication, Prehistoric Technology, Experimental Study of the Oldest Tools and Artifacts from Traces of Manufacture and Wear. Now, this didn't exactly receive tons of attention when it first came out. It was published in 1957 in Russia. It was only published in Russian. And part of this is also, it's Cold War era Russia. So not a lot of information is sort of getting out into the broader world. But it was finally published in 1964 in English in the UK. And it caught on very quickly in the archaeological field. People got really excited about this technique and the potential it had to help us answer a little bit more of the questions we wanted to get to. So now I'm going to kind of talk about the history of this discipline as it went across the world, because this one's kind of interesting. When it gets introduced, it sits in Russia for about 8 years, and then it sort of explodes on the scene. And the places it gets big first are Australia, the United States, and France. But in particular, scholars in the United States really grabbed onto this idea and kind of ran with it. So in the 1960s, some early progenitors start doing this. Keller, in particular, his 1966 work is probably some of the most advanced, as it's the first that emphasizes some of the steps in doing this analysis that we use today, primarily experimentation. So this is actually an image out of Keller's work. And what he did was he would take a flake stone tool, and he would take photos of it before, and then he would use it for a task. And then he'd take photos after and kind of document the differences on the edge of that tool. And this is a part of the process that we still use today. It's considered essential for a good microwear study. In the 70s is when this really starts to explode. The 3 papers that I list here are credited with the founding of what's considered modern microwear technique. And at this time, the field also separates into 2 areas of specialization called high power and low power use wear. So this is really where the modern era of microwear begins. Some of the really famous people involved, Sarah Semyonov here is pictured with Ruth Tringham, who's credited with some of the earliest kind of low power microwear. Now, what I mean by modern microwear is that Semyonov, when he was doing this work originally, remember, he really liked those striations. That was the main focus of his research. But as people started examining stone tools, they found that striations are there, but they're not actually that common. They can be really difficult to see on the surface of stone tools. And in fact, on some objects, they aren't there at all. So as people started doing more and more work on this, they found there are actually other areas of analysis we can do. Primarily, they started looking at things like flake scars, which you can see pictured in this lower image here. These little like kind of chips and nibblings on the edge of the tool that look a little bit similar to retouch, but I'll get into why these are kind of different later. And they were also interested in polish. You can see this upper image here. These are very, very close images of the edges of tools. And you can see the surface sort of looks shiny. This is that polish development that again comes as a product of use. Now, the 1970s also sort of formalizes the steps you need to take in order to have a successful microwear process. So primarily experiments and blind testing. So experimentation, this is kind of the part that I think gets students the most excited. It's really fun. This is literally going out and making and using stone tools. It's considered essential for a microwear analyst to, 1, do some flint knapping, understand how does stone behave when you're breaking it, when you're kind of shaping it into stone tools like you see in this upper right picture. 1, it also gives us some familiarity with things like the hardness of the raw material, because not all materials are going to behave the same way. It allows us to create comparative collections. So we get large groups of stone tools that we know what they're used for. So for instance, I might make a bunch of projectile points and then fire those projectile points into all kinds of different objects. I might have some go straight into the ground. I might have some actually hit animal targets. I might have some accidentally ricochet off a tree to see how it breaks. This gives us an idea of sort of lots of different uses for these tools. Now, a key part of this is when we're making them, we have to have sort of this balance between this is experiments, this is science. So we need to have a clear process for what we're doing. So we need to have an idea of sort of how much did we use the tool? How long was it used for? What action did we use and what raw material? We try to not use them too willy-nilly, but we do need to kind of make it natural. The past wasn't a clean place. If you butcher an animal with stone tools, I guarantee it will be a mess. But this is an important part of the process because we need it to be kind of as close to what it was like to do that task in the past as we can. So we're always sort of doing this balance of what I call naturalism and control. So get as close to the past as we can, but still not be too crazy about it. So one of the studies that I think is particularly interesting, so for some reason you want to read a really technical paper, George Odell did an experiment on animal targets with projectile points, where he was actually throwing spears and arrows into animals over and over again to one, see how many times can you throw it until it breaks, and also get that recording of how projectile point breaks when it does fail. And this gave us a really important part of use wear analysis. This is called a impact fracture, which is basically it hits something hard and the point breaks the tip off. And this is sort of a really easy way to identify a projectile point that's actually been used that successfully maybe went into an animal. The other aspect that's sort of considered essential to have a good microwear study is what's called blind testing. And this is a little different than other areas of archaeology. So if you do standard lithic analysis, if I hand you a group of stone tools and I say, tell me what kind of stone tools they are, I pretty much believe you that you know what you're doing. But for microwear, they have this kind of higher level of rigor where they want to be able to test you so you can prove that you really can do what you say you can do. And how this works is someone who is not me will pick a bunch of stone tools that we know the use for. So some of those experimental tools I talked about, they'll pick a bunch of them, and then I have to go analyze it without any knowledge about them. And then they grade me on how well I successfully identified, one, the location of the wear. So what surface did they use the stone tool on? And what did they use it for? And then they score you out sort of how well you did on all of this. And it's considered sort of ethical to then publish your results to show that you're like, hey, I've been assessed and it shows that I actually know what I'm doing. I really can successfully prove this technique. So this has become kind of standard fare within microwear analysis, and is actually something I think we should apply more broadly within archaeology. Now, the other thing that comes out of the 1970s is this split between the disciplines. So Semyonov wouldn't have identified as a low power or high power analyst. He just said he was a microwear analyst. But in the 1970s, there's two schools of thought that come out. There's what's called low power analysis and high power analysis. And they're exactly what you think you are. A low power analyst is examining things under microscopic levels that are lower than high power. So a low power microwear analyst generally examines tools between about 20 times magnification and about 150 times magnification. And this is going to limit what you see. Obviously, you're going to focus more on things like fracture mechanics, those little nibbles on the edge here, because you're looking at a larger space. What it finds is this means you see a little bit less detail about the tools, but it means you can look at a lot of tools really, really quickly. And it tends to be relatively low cost, as you're not going to need a very fancy microscope in order to do this. You just need like a moderately fancy microscope. High power analysts, this is where you kind of get into higher expense, but a lot more detail. They generally look at tools between about 100 and 500 times magnification. And at this close a level, you're not really going to be able to see those fractures like you see in the picture on the right. You're going to be pretty focused on polish and striations. That's what you're seeing here. This image is taken at about 350 times magnification. So you're looking at a very, very tiny, less than a millimeter area of this stone tool. It has some raw material limitations. Very coarse materials don't develop polish. So it means some stone tools couldn't be examined using high power. And it also means it's going to take you a long time. If every time you're looking through your microscope, you only see 1 millimeter of space, think about how long that would take to examine a whole stone tool. It's going to be a really slow process. You also tend to need a little bit more specialized equipment for this. This is when we get into our microscopes that are costing $30,000 plus. So if you got to pay that microscope off, you're going to have to charge a little bit more for your analysis. So you see, in the 1970s, we really started to formalize this as a discipline. It becomes much more rigorous, and we've split into these two fields. Now, whenever you have a field that splits and there become different camps, because we're archaeologists, because we're scientists, people are going to start yelling at each other. It's what we do. It's how we push our discipline forward. And I call the debate between low and high power analysts the ugliest debate in archaeology that you have never heard of. And this really kicks off in the 1980s. At this time, there's a lot of criticism from outside the microwear world. Other archaeologists are basically saying, I think this microwear technique is bunk. You can't do what you say you can do. I just don't believe you. I don't care what your blind tests say. I just think you're making it all up. Now, this is made worse by the fact that low power analysts and high power analysts are basically pointing the finger at each other. High power analysts are saying, you don't look with enough detail, your technique is sloppy, you're not really getting at actual behavior. And low power analysts are like, that's nonsense, your technique takes too long, it's too expensive, and you don't even understand how polish develops on stone tools, so how can you say you know what you know? And we see this particularly within published articles. There's a lot of sort of publications back and forth, in particular between kind of the founders of low and high power analysis, Lawrence Keeley and George Odell. Conferences are where this became kind of the most exciting. If we could have had Zoom calls back then between Odell and Keeley, I think they would have been pretty exciting because there's a lot of kind of yelling at each other. And at a conference in 1988, George Odell gave a talk that he called Brer Rabbit Seeks True Knowledge. And this was given in response to this sort of infighting between high power and low power analysis, in particular because high power analysis seemed to be getting kind of more traction within the field. And he wrote this parable. He wrote this story in the style of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby, where he basically says that, you know, we've sort of stopped doing science. People have gotten stuck in the tar pit of ideas and are not able to escape anymore because we're just being too stubborn. And he had this quote in there that I just think is really funny. He said, it was pointed out to me at the conference in which this parable was introduced that its presentation was arrogant. If so, it is the arrogance of a boxer who, down for the count of 8, refuses to let the lights go out. And this sort of foretells where this is going. High power analysis became far more accepted within the discipline. And low power analysis sort of became less common overall. Now, this infighting had some problems for us. One, what people don't realize is the original progenitors, Odell and Keeley, actually generally agreed with each other. They did a lot of fighting at conferences, but by the 90s, they pretty much said, yeah, low power and high power analysis both do what they say they can do. But depending which one you choose is going to limit the research questions you can answer. So if you go with low power analysis, you're not going to be able to know things like they were whittling hardwood versus softwood. You're just going to be able to know that they're doing some whittling of wood. So depending on what you want to know about your collection is how you should choose. But in sort of normal fashion, their students kind of picked up this debate and ran with it. And kind of they sort of kept this general disagreement going. Even though if you look today, most high power analysts actually start with low power analysis before they move on to looking at things at higher magnification. So what's the point? Why do we do this? There's lots of reasons we might want to do microwear analysis. One, I argue that it's probably one of the most direct routes to human behavior that we have. It's really easy to get wrapped up in just sort of the goodies of it all. You know, we're looking at these stone tools. They look really cool. They're exciting to see. But we have to remember that the point of this is we want to look at those stone tools on the left and we want to get at what's happening on the right. We want to understand what people are doing and why they were doing it. And microwear is a great way to do this because it actually gives us this thing was used for this task and can really help us define what our sites are being used for. So you can do things like maybe identify probable seasonality, like in the example I'm going to give in a minute. We can see specific site activities. We might be able to identify things like specialization if they're doing very specific tasks in very specific locations. The other thing that I think is important, I try to emphasize this, is we can't simply rely on what tools look like to interpret their use. This is sort of the temptation. You know, you see a projectile point and you say, well, it's a projectile point. I know what it was used for. It was used for hunting. But when is a projectile point not a projectile point? Couldn't it just as easily be used as, say, a knife? And how could you tell the difference? Microwear is how we get there. Or things like scrapers. A scraping tool could be used on any number of surfaces to work wood or hides or bone. But if we just see scraper, all we think is scraping. So this is what I call Monty Python logic. Because how do you know it's a projectile point? Because it looks like one. But I don't think that's good enough. I think we can get better than that. And this problem's compounded when we can't just look at it and make an assumption about its use. So I always use the example of everybody here has a flathead screwdriver in their house. If I make an assumption about what flathead screwdrivers are used on, they have one purpose, right? They're for putting in flat-headed screws. That's the only thing we should be using them for. But we all know that flat-headed screwdrivers get used for all kinds of things. Use them to open paint cans, or in older model vehicles, you can use them to start your car. Your starter's ruined, but it does work. Putting in an eye hole, or opening parts of your computer that Dell specifically asked you not to open. All of these are things that we use flat-headed screwdrivers for that are not their original intended use. And when we have stone tools like this, these simple flake tools, channel flakes, these are objects that have no sort of implication of what they could be used for, but they're perfectly suitable tools. Anyone who's worked with stone tools before probably realizes all of those edges are really, really sharp. And a lot of them would be great stone tools in themselves, even though you haven't shaped them into something more specific. So this is the kind of thing that microwear is really, really good at helping us answer. So now I want to talk a little bit about application. And I just wanted to give you a quick example of how we can use this technique to actually get at that human behavior. So get past sort of just the objects and really get at how did people behave in the past. I am really interested in Paleo-Indian studies. Probably not surprised by that. I've worked with Dick for a very long time. So I am interested in the time period in North America between about 12.9 years before present to 10.8. These people were highly mobile hunters and gatherers. So there's no agriculture at this time. They are sort of hunting animals, particularly caribou, which were widespread across New England at this time, and on the move a lot. We think they sort of moved their house on the regular. And I wanted to know, how does mobility affect technological use? And more than that, can we use tool use to identify what time of the year a site is occupied, and sort of how long they're staying there? And I used a really simple premise on this. The longer you stay in one place, the more tools you're going to use and the more activities you're going to do. So imagine you go to a campsite for a night. You're probably just going to hang out for a little bit, maybe not do too many activities. But if you stay there for 3 months, the range of activities you'll engage in is going to be much, much broader. And that's what I use to kind of examine Paleo-Indian sites in the past. So I looked at a total of 13 sites spread out across New England, and I examined more than 3,000 artifacts using low power microwear analysis. Because remember, if you're going to look at a bunch of stuff, you're going to look at it with a little bit less detail. And what I found appeared to show that indeed some sites had a lot more utilized artifacts than others. So in just looking at a couple of examples here, if we look at the Vale site, which is up in Maine, I've looked at well over 200 pieces from this site, and I found that 126 of them were used and about 134 didn't show any evidence, so about 50%. Whereas the Jefferson 6 B block, I looked at 145 artifacts and only 2 of them were used. Not a lot going on. Now, to be certain of this pattern, I did some math. Specifically, I did a what's called a bootstrap statistical model, which all it does is it lets you compare things of different sizes. I'm not going to get into that because this isn't a math class. That seems hard. But if you're interested in how to do a bootstrap statistic, I can explain it in more detail. Now, in addition to this sort of simple thing that some sites, there's more utilized tools than there are at other sites, I got into this more specific uses, and I kind of put these into use categories. So I looked at things like hunting equipment. So something that's a hunting equipment is a projectile point that actually was used as a projectile. And we're going to assume that they weren't just doing fun target practice. They're probably shooting animals. They may be something that I'm seeing butchery evidence on. So if they're actually using the tool to butcher an animal, that's hunting equipment. Hide working, I put separate, because what we know about people during the Paleo-Indian period in New England is that they would work hides on caribou very, very intensively. They butcher tons of caribou and they work the hides into their clothing. So I put hide working as kind of a specialized task. And then tool maintenance. This might be things like whittling to create the shafts for your atlatl darts or handles for your stone tools. So this is all sort of things, tool maintenance, making it so your tools are ready to go. And what I saw is sites with very few used tools at them also seem to be sites that they're really only doing kind of one sort of task. They're just doing one thing and not very intensively. Whereas our sites that have a lot more utilized pieces, they seem to have a much broader range of tasks. What this leads me to believe is that we're seeing 2 different ways of living off the land here. We're seeing really short-term occupations, which I call logistical sites. Think of this like this is a milk run. These are people getting sent out to the store to pick something up and bring it back to the group. But in the past, this would be things like go pick up some more stone to make stone tools out of, or go on a quick hunting trip to maybe do some encounter hunting of caribou. And at these sites, a lot of these activities are related to kind of tool maintenance, even with the very few tools that were actually used. A little bit of hunting equipment, a little bit of hide working. And most of the tools from these sites are what I call expedient. This is those tools that don't have a clear form. They're basically just flakes. The other group, this is the family. This is the old homestead. These are your residential sites. So this is where people are staying for a longer period of time. And this one, there's a really kind of a broader distribution of activities. We're seeing some tool maintenance, some hunting, some hide working. And around 40% of the tools at these sites are expedient. So we're seeing a flip-flop there in that relationship, where at these sites, there's fewer expedient tools. They're using much more formal technology. So expedient tools are still there, but they're less important. What I interpret from this is I think we can start seeing what might be some seasonal behaviors, some seasonal activities that are happening with these early Paleo-Indian people. Now, a lot of this I draw on what we know about caribou hunters, because we know people in the past here, they were hunting caribou. So I kind of drew on what do we know about seasonal rounds of caribou hunters and how can we apply that to these groups combined with this microwear data. So I said these logistical sites, these milk runs, these are sort of single or reoccupied sites, and they could be used any time of the year. And what they're doing here is they're probably going out, they're doing a lot of lithic reduction. At sites like the Jefferson 6B block, I saw a lot of sort of early reduction of stone tools, so it's a lot of big blocky pieces, and most of them aren't utilized. These tend to be located near sort of lithic sources, so it's sort of an easy interpretation. Like I said, very few utilized pieces overall. The second time is kind of hunters' camps. These are located pretty far from lithic sources. They tend to have sort of really late stage reduction. So think of it like if I've got my projectile point, I want to make sure it's sharp and ready to go hunt something. And I'm just going to kind of sharpen the edge a little bit, just take a little bit off. That's a lot of what we find at what I call these hunting camps. These, again, have really low numbers of utilized pieces. And what's there tends to be, again, just little bits of tool maintenance. So sites like the Colebrook site, if you're familiar with that at all, Hume, Morse, and Adkins all seem to kind of have evidence of this sort of smaller little hunting camps. But the big sites are where I think the most exciting stuff is, these residential sites. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Vail site. This one's fairly famous. This is up in Maine. And what I saw at the Vail site actually fits in really well with the original interpretations of this site. I saw tons of hide working. If you get to look at the Vail collection sometime, it's really cool. There's hundreds of scraping tools, and almost all of them are used to work hides. And I also saw lots and lots of butchery activities. If we look at caribou hunters that lived in the recent past, during the fall, they would have caribou tend to congregate in large groups that move across the landscape. And people would strategically position themselves on the landscape in order to kill lots of these animals. Now, in the fall is also when their hides tended to be the nicest. They tended to kind of, in the spring, what happens? Black flies come out, they bite us. They also bit animals, which could make their hides kind of patchy and crummy. So in the fall, the hides looked really good on these animals. So we think that this is when people would take them. So I would say from this evidence, the Vail site is probably a fall occupation where people were coming out, they're killing lots of caribou and making clothing out of it. The next one is Tennant Swamp. This is located in Keene, New Hampshire. I think Bob Goodby, is Bob talking about that this year? I think maybe.
Yep.
Yeah, the Tennant Swamp site down in Keene. This one was interesting. This site had a really kind of even mix of hunting and hide working and tool maintenance. There didn't seem to be one particular task that was really important. They're doing some of everything. So I think this is sort of a short to medium term occupation and probably in the late spring and early summer. I did get to cheat on this a little bit because the Tennant Swamp site, they found the remains of a baby caribou, which probably would be spring. So lucky me. It's always nice to have multiple lines of evidence. The last two I want to talk about are Michaud and Potter. The Potter site, if you guys know Dick, is located up in northern New Hampshire. And at this, I found a lot of tool maintenance activities with only sort of light hunting and hide working. And I interpreted this as gearing up. This is this idea that if you are going to get ready for a big fall hunt, that big event like we saw at the Vail site where they're killing tons and tons of animals, your gear needs to be ready to go for that. You can't kind of do that on the fly because you're going to need lots of scrapers, lots of projectile points. Everybody's got to be ready to rock. And at sites like Potter, this is what I think is happening here is people are getting their tools ready. They're kind of hanging out in this one location that's probably advantageous and has some resources that are helpful to them. And they're getting their tools ready. The general lithic analysis supports that. We see sort of scraper and biface manufacture zones. And one area in particular that has lots and lots of woodworking tasks. It sort of seems to be a specialized location where people are whittling and planing and kind of doing lots of woodworking related things. And this spot seems to be a fairly long-term occupation where people came back here again and again and again. And because of all the woodworking we see at this site, it might be that that was a resource that was easily obtained here. So to sum up, to me, microwear is one more tool kind of in our toolkit for understanding human behavior in the past. It can be really powerful for getting us these little bits of stone to what we really want. It's not just what we find, it's what we find out from David Hurst Thomas. So getting from these little bits of rock to how people behaved. And I think this is particularly powerful when we combine it with things like faunal analysis and normal lithic analysis. We start to get a much more complete picture of what happened in the past. And I think it's going to become an increasingly important part of collaborative research as archaeologists move forward. So I just want to say thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate the New Hampshire Archaeological Society for inviting me. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you have at this time. I will stop my share.
We've got a number of questions that were generated during your talk. And I'll start with one of mine. Does UseWare work on obsidian? It's really, really hard. And how much does the difference in the kinds of stone affect the analysis that you do for UseWare?
It's a great question. So obsidian, absolutely, you can do microwear analysis on it. This is sort of part of that experimental regime where when you start out, you have to work with the raw materials that are found at your site. So if you're working somewhere like Arizona, you should definitely be doing some experience on obsidian because the way obsidian is going to behave is going to be really different than something like a rhyolite. Really fine materials, those glassy materials like obsidian, they actually tend to be very brittle. So they break down and they crush much more easily than our sort of more robust cherts in the Northeast. So by doing those experiments, you can see how specifically those edges will respond to use. Now, the one exception to this is obsidian generally doesn't have very good polish development. This kind of makes sense, right? It's already super shiny. So it can be really hard to identify really specific uses, but you can do sort of generalized use patterns.
Okay. Another question about blind testing. What are your ideas about expanding blind testing to other areas of archaeology? Currently, it seems that validation is by consensus of professionals.
It's a great question.
Right or wrong, but you agree with me.
Exactly. Yeah. This is sort of an issue I see within archaeology sometimes and it's something we still face in microwear. Is a lot of people will be like, I don't believe you. And I'm like, but I have blind test results. I can actually show you that I could do what I say I can do. And they're like, yeah, but I don't like it. So no, thank you. I think we could expand this into other areas. For instance, a faunal analyst. How do you know a faunal analyst can identify what they say they can identify? We kind of just believe them, which, that's great. We should trust scientists, but it is nice to kind of have that they're pretty accurate at identifying species within your area. The world of archaeology is vast. you can't be experts on everything. So it's important to kind of have this backup system so you know what you're doing. Another area, actually, and this has been done to a small extent, radiocarbon labs, residue analysis, some of these chemical tests. Residue analysis in particular is often distrusted within our field. For those of you who don't know, residue analysis, this is chemical testing. So this is a little bit different than what I do. There are actually little bits of kind of residue left behind on stone tools. And people will analyze this and sometimes can identify things like a certain animal that was killed. But a lot of people are pretty suspicious because a lot of times before you submit your tools for residue analysis, they want to know what kinds of animals they should be looking for, which feels a little bit like leading the witness. So I think it would be worth kind of expanding blind tests to these other disciplines.
Okay, got another question. Are you able to tell the difference between a tool that's been lost, good, usable tool that falls out of somebody's pocket or was picked up by the 14-year-old kid and never seen again, from one that's been discarded because it could no longer be used because it was worn out? Can you distinguish between lost and discarded?
Well, lost to a certain extent, I think, is always within the eye of the beholder. Was it lost or was it just not good enough? Used up, that I can see usually. I mean, sometimes you can sort of tell because they get kind of nubby, and you'll see that they're really heavily used on the edge. So intensity of use is something that we can often identify really clearly, but sort of clearly distinguishing between, did they decide this one's done, I'm getting rid of it, or maybe it did have just a little bit more life left in it and they just dropped it, that can be hard. But intensity of use, to what extent it was used, can usually give me a little bit of that. If something's kind of just eaten up, I'll usually say that it was probably discarded at the end of its use life.
Oh, and that question was posed by someone who appreciated your recognizing the Russian archaeologist, and his name is Serge. So I think maybe that little home team there.
Semyonov does not get the credit he deserves. Very important.
I think that probably the Cold War era really biased our appreciation for archaeologists from other countries. Here's a rather specific question. Can 20 power magnification be used to identify hide scraping?
I wouldn't stop at 20 for sure. 20 times magnification is often sort of where we start because it tells us where to look closer. So when you pick up a stone tool to do analysis, you put it under the microscope and you start at sort of lower magnifications and you work your way up. Because some of what you're seeing is this edge of a tool completely smooth? If it is, it's probably not where I need to look closer. So 20 times mag is kind of where you start and then you work your way up. But you're not going to be able to confidently identify things like hide scraping until you start getting up into those probably 60, 80, 120 times mag.
I've got a question that always has interested me, and that is the so-called gravers, what we find in Paleo-Indian. Some of them have really delicate tips that I don't see is going to be successful in cutting something hard, but others are down to a little nubbin. Should we be breaking down the category that we call gravers into different kinds of tools? And how would you go about using USeware to do that?
That's a tough one. Most of the categories we make tools on, they're drawn on what we call morphological lines, what it looks like as opposed to how it's used. So it's simplistic, but it works. I would say probably not. Gravers seem to be one of those tools that's used for a whole diversity of tasks. We see some actual wood engraving, some working of soft materials, some probably one theory that was put out, which I thought was pretty interesting, and I think has some merit to it, is bone working, particularly making things like bone needles. If you're going to make a little eye on a needle, gravers, right? Perfect for that. So I wouldn't necessarily say we need to break it down more. I think our categories are by nature broad, but maybe that's okay. And we can just get more specific later.
Okay. And do we have any other last minute questions from our audience? Oh, here's one. From your early days in doing use-wear analyses to now, what lessons have you learned as you become more proficient? How have you grown?
Oh boy, that's a really good question. I would say there's a few big lessons. One is it's never too early to start being anal retentive about your data management. Use-wear databases get unwieldy and messy. And so I've gotten much better about being very controlled in that. I take a lot more photos than I used to. The first microscope I worked on had a really cumbersome photo setup. So I didn't take very many pictures when I did my work. But what I've discovered in the publishing world is everybody wants to see the pictures. Even if they have no idea what they mean and they're blurry and confusing, they want to see those pictures. So I take a lot more photos than I used to. And I've also found that there's few things more powerful than telling somebody, I don't actually know. I think one of the reasons why microwear kind of got a bad rap coming out of the 80s is kind of the general attitude of folks in the 80s when you were like, I need to come off as a god or goddess of archaeology, otherwise no one will believe me. And I always tell people when they give me a collection for analysis, I'm going to tell you I don't know what this is used for a lot. And that's just being a good analyst. That's being conservative in your approach and say, and you know what? We're not always going to know. We're not going to get 100% out of this, but I can give you a like bad guess, and then you're going to make a bunch of interpretations from my bad guess, or I can tell you I'm not sure, and we can just tag it as like this one's weird. And when we don't make bad interpretations off of worse interpretations.
Good. Saying that we're coming to the end brings them out of the woodwork. Here's another question, which is sort of global. How much can microwear analysis tell us about the nature of the society? For example, could we learn more about the nature of Neanderthal society and mind? Has there been work done on Neanderthal tools?
There has been work done on Neanderthal tools. And what's really interesting about it is it doesn't look any different than the uses of Homo sapiens tools at the same time. They're doing the same kinds of tasks. They're doing the same range of tasks, which may support evidence that Neanderthals had fairly high cognitive abilities because they're doing the exact same range of things. I think it's got potential for sure. Some of this is sort of detail. It's hard to see exactly, you know, when I say a tool was used to work bone, I just know it was used to work bone. I can't tell you what they made. And I think sometimes that's the part that's that next cognitive level of, you know, somebody just kind of carving a sharp piece of bone so they can go stab something, maybe not working with a lot. But if they're doing some sort of more advanced carving, they're doing sort of anthropomorphic or zoomorphic figures, expressions of art, maybe there's something to it. Not that there's anything wrong with carving a pointy stick. It's helped us survive for 2.5 million years. But yeah, we're sort of limited in how much we can say.
Okay, well, that pretty well brings us to completion. Heather, we really enjoyed talking to you today and appreciate your participation in our Archaeology Month series. And also, we want to thank the Archaeology Month Planning Committee for developing the series. And we would love feedback from the audience, either in the chat or by emailing president@nhas.org.